I'm thrilled to finally be in Bentonville and see the museum that is not only the talk of the nation, but you probably know that the entire world is abuzz talking about crystal bridges. It's exciting to see my piece in the collection. Thank you so much. And I thought I would describe to you the process of making my work, but also the thinking that goes on behind it. As I was putting the presentation together, I realized that making sculpture, for me, is really a method of inquiry. It's a way of exploring ideas. For the past 15 years, I've been focused on the question of beauty, the attraction of the female nude, both maternal and erotic, the allure of fashion, and the flirtatious interplay of the two. I've been using dresses and drapery to sculpt the female figure in absentia. And for me, it's the absence of the figure that's most important, because it tempers the undemanding pleasures of beauty with an air of mystery. When I make a sculpture, I want it to be both conceptually sound and visually engaging. I see aesthetics as the language of ideas and technique as the vocabulary. They are inextricably linked. To understand the message of an artwork, you need to be able to understand the messenger. And I have a real pet peeve for objects that are made poorly. As a result, in the studio, I'm a real stickler for details. One of my studio assistants used to complain that I spend months making something that will look like it has never been touched by human hands. And she's absolutely right. Then she was fired. But I'm such a nutter because I want to create a seamless visual experience, completely free of distractions. I look at the clothed figure as the interplay of two topographies, that of the body, the naked human body, and that of the dress. In my mind, this parallels the relationship between an individual and the society in which she lives. It's the transparency of cast glass that allows me to portray the two surfaces simultaneously, probing the relationship between beauty and individualism. Excuse me. The studio is where all of these ideas have literally developed and my observations have taken shape. So I thought we would go to the studio and start the process from the beginning. Some people believe that my technique is a big secret, but it's actually not. I have nothing to worry about because I'm the only person crazy enough to follow this through to the end. Here we go. My making absolutely begins with research, collecting thousands of images and filling sketchbooks with drawings and notes. I'm a bit of a bookworm, reading books that nobody else would even consider, such as The Annotated History of Crinoline, The Social Implications of the Girdle. You know, this is thrilling bedtime reading, let me tell you. My primary line of inquiry has been the presentation, how we dress ourselves, and then the representation of female beauty in art. I'm looking at everything from fashion magazines to figurative painting and sculpture. The process of investigation influences everything from making sculptures in the studio to creating installations. This is an amazing example of the exhibition I had in Tacoma, Washington, where I had completely forgotten visiting the German museum where these antique sculptures were installed. And as I created my own installation, obviously I was pulling that image from my subconscious. So that was pretty exciting to realize that I had sort of both aspects of my mind working all the time. In addition to the obvious influence of ancient statuary, when I'm sculpting, I feel I'm working with fabric, and I feel, I'm sewing and ironing. I feel very connected with contemporary fashion. And this is Madame Gris, who is one of my heroes. She worked actually in France in the early 1900s, and she draped directly on the figure of her clients, creating unique fashion items. My absolute favorite form of research is travel. It exposes me to new points of view and forces me to reassess my own values. In 1999, I received a Fulbright grant and I moved to Prague. I'm a native New Yorker, but Prague has really become my medieval home away from home. Now I'll show you why, if you haven't been there. It was thrilling to move to the center of Europe, to be in an ancient city surrounded by the art history I had spent so many years studying in school. Baroque and Renaissance art were everywhere. You couldn't walk around a corner or look up at a building without seeing a gorgeous statue. And inevitably, all of this visual information crept into my studio. When I moved to Prague, I didn't speak a word of Czech. And when I had my first wax sculpture ready and I went to the casting factory, they said one single word: Catastrophe. You do not need to understand Czech to get the message. I was totally destroyed. I couldn't really figure out why my work was such a catastrophe. I had made large-scale castings myself in the United States, and around me in the factory, I saw all of the equipment that was necessary. What I discovered is that the Czechs had an enormous experience casting glass, but only in an architectural and architectonic way. The amazing works of Professor Lubinsky and Mrs. Brichtova, who are really the pinnacle of Czech glass, were done without any undercuts. So as a result, the factory had no need to use wax and had no experience with the lost wax process. But my drapes and folds and the textures of the fabric I was trying to capture were completely different. And so it sounds sort of ironic or unlikely, but the lost wax process, a 5,000-year-old known technique, was introduced to this particular factory by me. This is the first piece I made in the Czech Republic. It took almost an entire year to make. And I was absolutely thrilled when I saw the piece for the first time. But in the second half of that heartbeat, I knew that I wanted the interior hollow to be the impression of the female body. So I set out on a new set of challenges. For me, this is the best part of making sculpture. It's like trying to solve a riddle or figure out a puzzle. I had a vision of what I wanted to make, but there was no established technology to make it. So to understand the process I came up with, which may still be imperfect, I thought we would walk through the making of a single piece. I start by choosing the model and the position she will be in. I work with different shapes, size, and age of women for their ability to physically embody emotion. In making Dress with Wrinkled Cowl, I wanted to reinterpret classical beauty. I worked with a model who was a friend of mine from the Academy in Prague and asked her to take the absolutely classical contrapposto position from, referencing the history of sculpture. But when I dressed her, I really wanted to work with a more contemporary style from the 1940s. First, I start by taking a life casting off of her body, and then I use that mold to make a rubber positive. And in all of this going back and forth, I'm very careful to capture every detail, even goosebumps and the reality of a small piece of hair. And I'm so obsessed with these details because in my mind, I really believe that it's the realism that creates the sense of mystery in the final sculpture. You see a dress and you can just wonder, where's that woman who was in there? I paint molten wax on that rubber positive, creating a shell which will then be removed. All of the details that were on the surface of the model's skin are now moved to the inside of the sculpture. So peering inside the dress, you'll see the goosebumps on the flesh of a woman who is no longer there. So first I take the shell off, and then I use a light to check to make sure it's a uniform thickness. Once completed, this wax shell is my canvas, fabric and drapery are my paint, and beauty is my topic. And it's my favorite time in the studio now. I might dress and undress a piece for, days and days. To quote my favorite art critic, Libby Lumpkin, she says, "Making gives physical address to ideas." And it's such a beautiful thought of, taking something abstract and just setting it down in the world for other people to see. Now I'm composing, and this dressing and undressing, it takes a couple of weeks, but as I'm working, I'm constantly visualizing the interplay between the outer layer of that dress and the inner layer of the body. In working on Dress with Wrinkled Cowl, I was thinking about the 1940s, an era of changing roles for women in society, entering the workplace, becoming both confident and feminine. As I was working aesthetically in the studio, I was really focused on the texture and density of the wrinklage on that cowl. I wanted to perfectly capture this combination of confidence and femininity. Once the composition is finished, I cut away the wax shell where there is no drapery. And now this gets into my following the rules of my thinking, because I want to look at the body as it's defined by the clothing that it wears. According to my logic, this is the individual as defined by the society in which she lives. I would lip sync this, but all I'm doing is cursing in Czech, so I'm trying to get my way. This is now back at the factory where a new type of work begins. It's where I've developed my diplomatic skills. I have to negotiate to get things done exactly the way I want. The first step is taking the piece apart into castable segments. And I am a completely enthusiastic American. I believe that anything is possible. And I always want to make things more complicated than the workers at the factory say they can safely be made. And a lot of artists say to me, "Don't you get frustrated with this?" And I say, no, because I can't make the work, I'm only one person. And to make the work on the scale that I want to, I really need an industrial facility and a team of people to work with. So it brings its own set of challenges, but I embrace them. The details that I've worked so hard to preserve in the wax are now transferred to the inside of a plaster silica mold. Each segment of the sculpture has a separate mold, and making the mold for one segment is about 4 days. For an entire sculpture, it takes a couple of weeks. Somewhere around 500 pounds of mold material is poured around the wax, and prior to this, the wax has been surrounded by rebar and that in turn surrounded by containment walls. And the result is that I have this big white block. Next, the wax is melted out, and in the finished mold, you can see the two layers that I talk about, that interior body and the clothing on the outer surface. The mold then dries several weeks and is loaded into the ovens. Another thing about the factory that amuses me is that I work completely with a team of men. And some people say, well, are you being, do you feel uncomfortable with that? And for me, it just adds a layer of irony that my studies in femininity are made using so much testosterone. My work is kiln cast. So what that means is cold glass is loaded on top of the molds. The kiln temperature is raised to the melting point of the glass, and then it flows down, filling in that cavity that was left by the wax. Unfortunately, the large scale of my work requires very slow, uniform cooling, which is called annealing. And this is my least favorite part of the process because I'm actually just impatient. And that is the view for the next 50 days. And there's nothing you can do. You cannot open the door. If you open the door, you'll destroy the piece completely. So I just wonder what's happening. Finally, the door does open, and hopefully you have some success. And this is a funny sort of thing that I learned by being working in Europe, is in the United States, we do everything ourselves. That's what I was taught at art school. I was, making my own molds. Oh, there I am yelling in Czech again. More cursing. We really are a DIY nation. In Europe, there's a completely different structure. Artists from the academy work with trained craftsmen who help them to realize their work. And this is a long-standing tradition. The funny thing for me is that I'm somewhere in the middle. I'm a kind of a conundrum at the factory. They don't know if I'm one of the guys or someone from the academy that should be revered. My work is monumental. I have to use an industrial facility and teams, but I remain involved in every aspect of the process. And that's really a function of my obsession with details. Because I've paid so much attention to the details in making the wax, I want to make sure that nothing is lost. And so, I stay there for cutting, grinding, fitting, and finishing. So finally, after 9 months, more than 9 months, I have a finished piece. And despite the technical challenges, I always hope that the elegance of the finished piece transcends the effort of its making. I love working with glass because its transparency gives me the opportunity to work with layered meanings. And for those of you who have not seen the piece, it is here in the museum. So as promised by the title of the lecture, now we're going to talk about everything that goes wrong. That was a very nice success story, but it's not always so nice. Working beyond the frontier of tradition and pushing the envelope of established technology is high risk. At the factory, we take every precaution we possibly can. I buy massive quantities of glass produced in a continuous melt furnace, which ensures its uniformity. So this is something I believe I buy in quantities of 18 tons. So that's 18 tons of glass. Even so, we inspect every piece of the glass with a polariscope, and this detects impurities that are invisible to the human eye. Then we also inspect every piece once it comes out of the oven after the casting. The kilns are monitored with a dual temperature system. They let us know if there's a 1 degree difference between the top of the kiln and the bottom of the kiln. 1 degree can actually have a fatal impact on a casting of this size. Nonetheless, sometimes our systems fail, and you would think, how is that possible? Well, everything I can understand with my terrible Czech is that a lamppost in the old town square of the town is the culprit. So here's the story. One day, the town didn't tell anybody at the factory, but to change a transformer in the lamppost, they cut off the power to the entire town. It wiped out the programming and the computer controllers, and everything that was in process broke to pieces. I had 5 ovens filled with work that were in the final stages of annealing, and everything was broken. So we took military measures, and we bought a diesel generator from the Finnish army. So that's the most recent piece of equipment that we've acquired at the factory. So this is almost the entire team of people that I work with. We're such an unlikely group. If we were a band, I think we'd be called Karen and the Honey Bears or something. But they are amazing guys. They were not sure of me in the beginning, but now we are working really well together. And each one of them is a specialized craftsman. The mold makers just make the molds. The cold workers just do the cold working. And as the author, I'm the one who's pushing out against the limits, but really all of these men participate in that challenge. At the end of every year, we celebrate our successes and drown our sorrows at the Christmas party. drinking shots of white lightning, basically. It's check moonshine. And for me, that is the biggest catastrophe of all. So just in the way that making sculpture is a method of inquiry, when I put together an exhibition at a museum, it's also a form of inquiry. It's as if the exhibition as a whole becomes a new object with its own questions and references. At the Museum of Glass in Tacoma, Washington, I saw the exhibition space as a stage. I used both sculptural curtains and cast glass curtains to emphasize the theatrical feeling. I invited viewers to cross a threshold into a surreal world inhabited by vacant costumes. I used dramatic spotlights to illuminate the statues like actors in a suspended performance. In this exhibition, I started seeing an abandoned tableau vivant. In the 19th century, the tableau vivant was an erotic entertainment with nude actors who, because of their nudity, were forbidden from moving. In my tableau, it seemed that the prohibited nudity was transferred to the costumes. Clothing had taken on the sensuality of the body, and fabric had almost become flesh. As I had hoped, the lifelike details from the castings evoked a very visceral response. The details did create a sense of mystery which engaged the viewers. And several times I walked through the exhibition sort of incognito, and I saw people peering inside, just thinking to themselves, what happened to the woman who was wearing this dress? The lines between the sculpture and the audience were blurred. It's almost as if there was a conversation going on between the people visiting and the pieces I had made so long ago. In a completely different exhibition in the Renaissance building on top of the Romanesque basement at the Czech Museum of Fine Arts, that only happens in Europe. Here we build buildings all at once. There was a completely different atmosphere. The history of the building itself already suggested the passage of time. And as I worked on the installation, I was more aware than ever that the present is rooted in the past. In the crypt-like space, time's ability to dematerialize our world was made palpable to me. And I really had a sense of my own mortality as I was doing the installation. You know, it was not my most optimistic period. But it let me focus on the aspect of immateriality in my work. It's a theme that really resonates between the emptiness of the dresses and the absent viewers in the mirrors. I titled the exhibition Vanitas, which refers to a genre of painting in Latin meaning emptiness and suggesting mortality. It was the first time I had exhibited the pieces called lark mirrors, and they were referencing a 16th century bird trap. But the phrase colloquially has come to mean a fatally attractive illusion. The mirror is a symbol of beauty, but I was using it as a reminder of how fleeting that beauty really is. I wanted the etched faces to be spectral and ephemeral, appearing and disappearing as you moved around the room. And I think sort of my idea came from when I was a kid. I loved to draw on a cold window. I would breathe onto the cold window and just make little drawings in it. And for me, it was fun to link the images with the immateriality of breath. It was almost like the image had been exhaled onto that mirror for one instant. Finally, onto one of my favorite exhibitions, which is at the Chrysler Museum of Art. And there, a small group of my sculptures were installed amongst the neoclassical collection. A large dress that I had made before I ever went to the museum and saw their collection was installed next to Undine rising from the waters. And it was almost uncanny, the aesthetic connection, the visual connection between my abandoned dress and their mythical Undine. Several busts I had made were installed next to their 18th century ideal busts, which were faith, hope, and charity. And I felt my sculpture added fragility to that collection. Finally, in the entry area, a reclining dress that I had made was, again, before ever seeing their collection, was paired with a Roman sarcophagus from 200 AD. And again, the two works were aesthetically and thematically connected over thousands of years. So in thinking about the passage of time, I realized in 2007, I realized I had been in Prague for 10 years. I was surrounded by buildings like this, and I felt I had almost become oversaturated by my personal heritage and surroundings. While it was a wonderful influence on developing this body of work, I felt I needed a change, and I wanted to look at the expression of female beauty in a completely different culture. So I went to Japan. I went to Japan on a 7-month research fellowship, just strictly research, from the Japan-US Friendship Commission. I chose Japan and the kimono because it seemed different in every possible way from the work I had been doing. I reframed my inquiry about beauty by looking at the kimono and all of the culture that surrounds it. I was extremely lucky to be ingratiated by a group of individuals who were devoted not only to kimono wearing, but to all of the traditional arts of Japan. We practiced calligraphy and a special incense game that heightened your awareness of smell and therefore taste. To me, they were like a group of superheroes. Each one had a special power. My favorite was Manami-san. He was the master kimono maker specialized in yuzen dyeing of fabric. There was a Zen gardener and a calligrapher. There was Mrs. Matsubara, a professional geisha dancer who actually taught me how to tie the obi in all of the different ways. There's thousands of knots. And finally, there's our fearless leader, Professor Morikawa, who was just an incredible source of knowledge. They're so respectable looking, but we would end every Friday with another tradition, which is a huge sake party. And this was, I think, my favorite part of learning. It's when they finally really relaxed and told me everything. When I was in Japan, I lived in Kyoto, in the traditional kimono making area called Nishijin. My neighborhood literally hummed with the sounds of kimono making. And I wandered into workshops that specialized in everything, the dyeing of the thread, the weaving of the fabric. You know, I was right in the center of everything. I learned the kimono vernacular, the various obis, both the ties, on the kimono itself, the different sleeve lengths, the symbolism of the dyed and embroidered images. But I wanted to understand the kimono from the inside out. So I learned how to wear one. I was taught the importance of de-emphasizing my body by eliminating all of my curves through padding and binding. And it was very, very ambitious and uncomfortable. It was something else. And I would go through this because the idea of wearing a kimono, the ideal shape is a cylinder, and that shape displays the kimono's imagery. So, what I learned through all of my research was that the Japanese idea of beauty and its relationship to individuality is completely different from anything I had experienced in the West. Beauty is much more esoteric, almost focusing on what is not seen. By putting on the kimono, one is assuming the appropriate role in a greater group. And it's the language of the kimono that announces your place in society. In the padding and binding, wearing a kimono is literally about the erasure of one's body, and you're giving up individuality. It's like becoming a blank canvas. The kimono also literally defines how a woman moves. There's a saying that says, a kimono is not so much a garment as a way of behaving. And in traditional Japanese values, the restricted movements conferred by the kimono are considered the most beautiful. Putting on a kimono is literally about taking a step closer to an ideal. An uncomfortable ideal, but. So after 7 months, I returned to Prague. My head was bursting with thoughts. My luggage was bursting with kimonos. I think I brought back 250 kimonos. And I also paid $7,000 in overweight on my luggage. I think that might be a world record. But I was transformed by my experiences. And it's really been 5, now almost 6 years that these experiences have sort of trickled down into a new body of work in the studio. I went back to the studio with new challenges. Instead of the absent body of the dress, now I was dealing with an unseen body, a body that had been erased. To make my invisible women, what I did was I used biomechanical data from NASA's website, creating the exact average nobody. So I went with the 50 percentile mean of a Japanese female at 50 years of age in 1 gravity. As I worked in the studio dressing these nobodies, I followed all of the rules that I had learned from my very patient and precise teachers. But in the back of my mind, there was always this tickling question of what materials would I use to realize the sculptures. And I couldn't get away from the thought that the entire Japanese attitude towards beauty and the perception of beauty is the attitude towards body and the perception of beauty is informed by Buddhism. And although I'm not a Buddhist myself, I think when I went to choose the materials I wanted to work with, they reflected this Buddhist ideal of heaven, earth, and man. I found myself reaching for familiar materials, but for completely new reasons. In the past, I had used glass for its translucency, and now to me it seemed to embody immateriality, almost the spiritual realm. Clay, which was a completely new material for me, seemed to parallel the humility of Japanese beauty. A kimono in clay, the idea of wrapping oneself in the earth, is a beautiful metaphor for human impermanence. Finally, I chose bronze to represent the realm of human intervention. It is a timeless but completely man-made material that we use to represent our victories and our failures. In our bronze monuments, we record our social history. And although the kimono really framed my inquiry, there were many other less obvious influences which I could not have anticipated. The acute awareness of light in architecture helped me develop a new sense of how light works on the surface of various materials. For example, ceramic, how light travels over the surface, versus glass, how light travels just below the surface. And perhaps most fascinating to me was a practice called kintsugi, or golden joinery, and it's where gold is used to highlight a damaged object. The object becomes more valuable and beautiful because of these golden repairs. They reflect the passage of time and sort of humanize the object. And what Professor Morikawa explained to me was that a pristine object is almost seen as vain. So sometimes when I was working in the studio, I would intentionally rush the drying of clay to force the clay to tear so I could repair it with kintsugi. And for me, it became a subtle but captivating aspect of my studio work. With my increased focus on imperfection, on fissures adding to beauty, I became interested in Crackle Glazes, and this is traditional celadon. I wanted to highlight imperfections. I wanted to make sculptures more beautiful because of their flaws, so I applied sumei ink to the surface, allowing it to wick into the cracks. And I was fascinated by this visual matrix of cracks that was caused by the incompatibility of the two materials, the clay and the glass of the glaze that was on the surface. And it was so funny to me, after fearing cracks in glass for so many years, now I was celebrating them, and it almost felt like a form of revenge. I was also influenced by the Japanese respect for nature and the appreciation of the changing seasons, the real ephemerality of nature. I laid flowers into the kimono mold and pressed the clay over them. And as the clay dried, the flowers died and burned away during the firing. These left very fine botanical impressions that I would then work with afterwards. Some of the botanical impressions I accented with gold leaf, using gold not as a symbol of wealth, but simply as a carrier of light. I also became fascinated with what are called tomobako boxes. And these are individual boxes for every object of every ceramic object. And the box really tells the history of the object in writing and stamps. So when I made my sculptures, I made each one of them a tomobako box. I made the boxes from old wood, and I knew that I wanted to write on them with calligraphy. And I had an idea of the symbols I wanted to use and what I wanted to say, but I am not a master calligrapher. And miraculously, two women who were masters were having an exhibition in Prague. And I went to their opening, and I showed them images of my works. And I said, I really want to write on these boxes. And they said, oh, we'll come to the studio tomorrow morning at 8. So they showed up. They were spectacular. We had a hilarious conversation about symbols and the meaning of words and the ideas I was working with. And then they left behind this, it was like a tsunami going through that left behind this beautiful detritus. Every single piece of wood in my studio was written on. So after 4 years of work in the studio and a bit further research, I built the first exhibition, which took place just 1 year ago. The title of the exhibition was Floating World, and I chose the title because this is really the realm of geisha and kabuki, and it's the present-day domain of beauty and kimono. Of particular interest to me in choosing the title, it's yukio in Japanese, and yukio is also a homophone, which means sorrowful world. And in putting together the exhibition, I wanted to try and capture that very austere sense of beauty that permeates all of Japanese life. It was the first time anybody saw the works in ceramic, so I was a little bit terrified. And what I realized in talking to people about the work was that all of the vocabulary I was working with in ceramic really came from tea ceremony. Even the title of this kneeling piece, which is chado, it means the way of tea. Observing tea ceremony in Japan, I became sadly aware of the fossilization of traditions. And in the installation, the sculptures almost became like relics, a vision of beauty from a different era. I started to see the geisha as a symbol, not a specific woman. Her clothing, makeup, codified movements really made her a cliche. She really exists in the realm of the imagination almost, a quickly disappearing icon of female beauty. After so many years of looking at the nude in Western culture, In Japan, I found a completely different relationship between physical body and nudity. From public bathing to a woman in a kimono, the body is not seen. It's not that it's covered up or absent, it's almost as if it doesn't exist. In that way, the kimono has more to do with the realm of emptiness, since the body has no existence of its own. And this reminded me of my favorite character from calligraphy, which is called Mu. And it means emptiness, but not sort of emptiness of the milk container when you're having your coffee. It's the emptiness of the sky that contains the universe. It's sort of a beautiful, full emptiness. And I feel like these empty kimonos reflected the Japanese obsession with ephemerality, and that they could portray somehow that somber sense of beauty. But part of my goal, I wanted to create that atmosphere, but I also wanted to recreate the sense of unfolding discovery that I had experienced in Japan. So what I did was I hid tiny little botanical elements on the inside of the kimonos. And I thought that as people were going around the exhibition, if they peered on the inside, the way so many people do when they look at my sculpture, that they would have this great surprise, that there would be this just glint of gold in there. Sometimes I placed botanical elements with leaves cascading so far down into the bottom of the kimono that their discovery would be impossible. And I liked the idea that buried deep inside of my sculpture, there was an element of completely unseen beauty. Back to the studio. So I had no experience with clay, unless you count playing with Play-Doh when you're a kid, and in my case, that was really more of a culinary endeavor. I found myself back at the same place I was with glass so many years ago. I had a clear image of what I wanted to make, but there was no established technology for doing it. So I spent quite a bit of time at a ceramic research center in the Netherlands called EKWC. And they told me that I had invented a unique way of working with clay. And unfortunately, of course, glass does not hold the monopoly on catastrophes. Invention comes with its share of mishaps. And in the end, I was able to solve my stumbling problems along the way. But sometimes it would happen, I would have a piece completely formed, and I would take the mold off when it was too wet, and it would just fall into my arms. And I felt like I was dancing with a 250-pound geisha, It's terrible. Kiln errors as well followed me to my new material. Just 2 weeks ago, as I was leaving, I had 6 pieces in the kiln, and there was a computer error, of course. The kiln spiked up, and all the work exploded. So this is the day I left my studio, and you can imagine what I'm doing is I'm piecing together all of the parts, and my intention is to kintsugi them all back together. And people always ask, how long does it take you to make something? And recently I found this book on Japan, which I made when I was 8 years old. So I guess the answer is, it only takes a lifetime. Thank you very much.